Good evening, Joshua and Sarah. Welcome to the fourth webinar. Can I be heard loud and clear?
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Rebecca, could you just let me know on the back end if you can hear this on the live broadcast? Good evening, Joshua and Sarah. Welcome to the fourth webinar. Can I be heard loud and clear?
We can hear you.
Yes, you can.
Rebecca, could you just let me know on the back end if you can hear this on the live? Yes, I got a bit of an echo out there. So, yes. So my clock tells me that it is 7 o'clock. So let's start with this hangout. And thank you so much for joining us. And for this week, we've had the wonderful topic about gendered poverty and continuing on our discussions on gender. And we have one more week, which is a gender-based topic and theme. And I think this has been an interesting week and chapter-wise, and of course, in terms of looking at how current media and the world is reporting on gender, and we'll discuss that in the course of this this webinar. But because we have a topic already, which was that we wanted to hear a little bit about Sarah's research, especially for your studies, and I know that there's an extensive body of work that has been happening in Nicaragua. I wanted to start with you, Sarah, and if you could talk to us about your research and how many years it's been and what has been your experience with it so far.
Okay. Oh, the Sarah show. This is nice.
We'll start with the Sarah show.
I'm sure we'll end up on the Joshua show.
No,
we'll be
shouldn't.
there. So the research that I've been doing recently and what we were talking about was around this so-called feminization of poverty. And this research that I've actually been doing, the research I've been doing very recently, that's just coming out now, has been with Sylvia Chant from the London School of Economics. And we're going to have a little snippet of Sylvia. I think it's next week she's going to appear, so watch out for that. And also with Brian Lineker, who I've worked with for a number of years. And why this particular research area came about was because we were interested in how people understand women's poverty. And I think the question that Rebecca posed this week was around what don't we know about women's poverty, not what do we know, because actually we don't know very much. And that might surprise a lot of people because since the 1970s, we've been talking about poverty as having a female face. That phrase became quite popular around 70s onwards. And in 1995, in the Beijing conference, the UN conference, it was stated that there was a feminization of poverty. 70% of the world's poor were women and rising. And this became the notion that poverty was feminized and feminizing. So we have this notion of the feminization of poverty. Now, so that was 1995. And people who have been working in the field doing small scale studies have been contesting this notion for a very long time, saying, what is the basis for that statistic? Where does it come from? And in 2015, the latest UN's, it's about to come out again. So the 2015-16 UN's report on the progress of the world's women, in a footnote, said that this factoid of 70% was unknown what the source was, and it was probably untrue. So we've had 20 years of stating this, policymakers use it all the time, and finally 20 years later we state, oh, actually we don't know. And in the UN report, again, it said we don't know how many of the world's poor are women. Yet what's interesting about this is we have a lot of data out there, so how can we not know how many of the world's poor are women? Because all you need to do is separate between men and women, and surely you should know. And what it raises is two issues. One, it raises an issues around measurement, and the other is around policy assumptions. So in terms of measurement, our research was looking at how we're being measuring, breaking down the stats that we do have, and critically engaging with them. So there's two ways you can really look at empirical data. You can collect your own, which I've done for a number of years, and so Sylvia Chant, who I work with. But the other way is to look at the large-scale data sets and critically examine those. So any of you out there who can't go out to the field and collect your own data but want to engage with data, get a hold of one of these data sets, look at published reports, and look at them critically. Look at the assumptions being made around this data. And that's all we've really been doing. And when you look, what the problem, one of the big problems is that when we measure deprivation, we look at it at the household level. Now, what you need to think about is the own households you live in. And the policy assumption in many ways is what comes into the household, the income that comes into the household is then fairly distributed within the household. Differentiated by age, for example, for younger people, but that's the assumption made. Now, if you think about your own household, I'm sure you know this, it's not evenly distributed, the resources that come into the household. And particularly when we're young, we can all think of a time when you'd say to your parents or guardians, well, I know you've got money, why can't I have this? And it's partly, and they'll say, well, when you earn your own income, then you can make your own decisions. So decision making within household is unequal. Resources are shared unequally within households. But when we measure poverty, we measure it at a household level and then disaggregate between men and women within that. So how we know women's poverty then isn't about women living in households with men. The only households we know where about women's poverty is women who head their own households. So our data on gendered poverty is actually data comparing female heads with male heads. And the majority of the world's women live in male-female partnerships. So we've got this data, it's not disaggregated, or we're looking at women as being female heads. And there's many reasons why female heads will be poorer, because women across the globe earn less than men. And also, of course, men and women in a partnership may be working together and bring in more income. So by essence, we're going to have, using this data, women constructed as the poorest. Now, if women are constructed as the poorest, and this is the feminization theory, then why should we worry about that? Because that's going to mean resources are targeted at them. And this has been the policy assumption. Women are the poorest, therefore we will target them. Also, it seems. Because what we see then is women are being targeted with resources, but when we look behind why the policymakers are doing that, it's not actually to reduce women's poverty, because we actually have no data to show there's any women's poverty anyway, but we have a policy assumption that there is a women's poverty. So if we target resources at women, it will make it better for them. But then women are socially constructed, as we talked about, to share the resources with the household. So in fact, what policymakers are doing are using the non-data, the assumption that women are poorest, to target resources at them on the knowledge that they will then share them with the rest of the household. So women's poverty then, this feminization, the actual policy may not reduce women's poverty. And if we look at Latin America, for example, we've seen that Latin America has had a reduction in poverty across most of the countries, but women's poverty hasn't necessarily reduced, but we don't really know because we don't have the data. And in our research, we've recently examined it, and we found in 4 countries, I think we had feminization of poverty, and in 4 countries, we had defeminization. So we've got these different trends, and we just don't know. What we do know is that inequalities are getting greater, and gender inequalities presumably as well. And what's interesting then, and what we're pointing out in our research is, if women's poverty is, if women are assumed to be the poorest, why aren't those who are evaluating poverty policies or interested in data, including the SDGs, why are they not more interested in finding out the reality of gendered experiences of poverty? Why?
Sarah, while you're telling us this, actually, there's a question that's just come in from Reggie, and he's asking us exactly this question: what can be done to address gender inequality in poverty? Is there something that can be done by governments, by civil society, by private sector, with the various stakeholders that are present?
I guess to add to that also, how much of the indicators around goal 1 are in any way mindful of this debate?
I think if you look at the main indicator of goal 1, we're still on poverty lines. And if we're looking at poverty lines, we've got an issue there. I mean, poverty lines have been contested since poverty lines began. Yeah. I mean, they're hugely problematic. And the notion of going inside the household seems very difficult, but all it means is asking men and women the same questions. So you could effectively do it. And at the lower level, we have been doing it on community level. It raises the issue. It's not so much what should we do, because we could do it. The question is, why are we not doing it?
No.
And it suggests then that as a policy level, gendered experiences of poverty are not that important.
Are we back to this private public? Are we back to that old debate of what happens behind the household, behind the closed door? We can't really penetrate. Is that what?
Well, you'd think, but it's quite interesting because when you look at policies, they're doing that.
Yeah,
in many ways, they're going into the household and targeting resources at women. But what's interesting about that as well is why they're doing it. And apologies to men everywhere, but this is based on research before I say it. And often I go, oh, that's not true. But what we find is at community level study, household level studies, that when men get an income, they withhold quite a large proportion of that. Up to 50% is withheld for their personal consumption outside the household. When women get an income, they're socially constructed to use it. for the children. So what we're back to these gender constructions again. So the social construction for men is to go out and socialize and use their income. The social construction for women is to share it with the household. So if you're a policymaker who wants to get the best out of your money, who are you going to target it at? You're going to target it of women, obviously, because it's much more difficult to change the behavior of men.
Yeah.
It's much better to ride on the back of the behavior of women. So you're reinforcing that.
But I also wonder, from a pragmatic policymaker's perspective, if you're looking at economic growth, whether policymakers are thinking, well, actually, it makes more sense to target men because they're going to put the money out there and the economy is going to grow.
You should be an economist because no
I'm
one's come up with that line before.
So.
No one's suggesting that, no, because I'm this way in terms of what policymakers who are interested in economic growth are talking about is, of course, women as an untapped resource. Yeah. So what they're trying to do is get women into the workplace. Because, again, social construction suggests that women are better at tedious, repetitive jobs. They complain less, they work harder, they're better at multitasking. So when we're looking at economic growth, again, targeting at women, but only certain jobs. Those jobs that men aren't that good at, because social construction means they won't sit there and do that, but women win. There's a long time ago, I think it was 1980, early 1980s, there was a very famous article called Nimble Fingers Make Cheap Workers.
Wow.
And that was Ruth Pearson and Diane Elson who wrote that. And it was, the title just says it all, doesn't it?
It does.
It absolutely says it all. And that's true.
So Sarah, where do conditional cash transfers, Bolsa Familia, how does this deconstruct that for us in the context of this analysis?
I think the conditional cash transfer programs are one of the problems, some people would argue, and often in our research we're trying to put the two together. So we're saying we've got the feminization of poverty, but what we're arguing is we don't actually know we've got feminization of poverty, but what we have got is a feminization of poverty alleviation programs.
Right.
And they're conditional cash transfers which give cash to households targeted via women, but the aim is with the health and education of children to break what they call the intergenerational poverty cycle. So when children are healthier and more educated, it will reduce poverty in the future. So they aim to reduce poverty now and in the future. And because they're targeting the resources of women, often claim also then it's a gender empowerment issue.
Sarah, we've just got a question actually, and this is from Dominic. He says that when women share their income, is it because they are altruistic or out of self-interest? Now, I want to expand this. When we're looking at self-interest for a woman, does she automatically consider her family? What is, in terms of, is that what is expected of us? Is that a social construct? Is that life or gender?
I think what Dominic's getting at is that there is this issue. So altruism is learned, I think. I don't think, women are naturally more altruistic than men. I know many women who are highly altruistic, but it seems to be an unusual characteristic. But women are taught from the beginning that this is how you should be, caring and giving. And when they have children in particular, that's the mother's role to do that, to be self-sacrificing for their children. And often constructing men then as not really caring about their children, which of course we know is not true, but that's those stereotypical ideas. But I think the self-interest bit comes in, that if the only value that a woman has in society is as a mother, then obviously have to play that role as well as they can. And if being altruistic proves they're a good mother, then obviously that's better for them, because in the future, their children hopefully will then look after them in their old age. So I think that's a self-interest idea that we're getting at as well.
The peer pressure element of it too, right? There's an expectation of how a woman is meant to behave in that circumstance, and that is a standard, and I guess people are held up to that standard, and that creates a pressure too.
And I think the conditional cash transfer is going to add to that, because in these programs, women have to attend sessions to learn how to be better mothers. And so if you're not part of that program, then you're not a better mother.
Yeah.
So you've got that whole thing going on. It's playing on those gender roles. It's not challenging them. It's actually reinforcing them. And then if that's how you're valued, then as a woman, it's rational to be the best mother you can, to be altruistic. So you can see how it's self-perpetuating.
Thank you. Joshua, a big question out here is that the role of law, of course, in feminization or defeminization. Does law recognize this? I know Sarah would have comments on that. And what is the role, or you can say what is the core that we're looking at in terms of the role of law? Will it actually be implementable, or again, is it just something that is there so that we recognize that it is a phenomenon that needs to have a corrective impact, but it might be many, many years before we see that in effect?
Yeah, no, it's a difficult question. I mean, and I was thinking that through listening to Sarah's, I think, very clear articulation of the issue, because I certainly always assumed that there was a feminization of poverty. And I realized that the answer is more nuanced, and it really, the answer, it does depend. So already when you start with that problematic, you think, well, so law can't necessarily address defeminizing poverty where poverty isn't feminized. So you'd already have to be context specific, and that's your first challenge there. The other thing is that law now for millennia has treaded this fine line between seeking to maintain order and seeking to worry about justice. And inevitably, because of the fact that law is patriarchally structured and structured in the interests of the powerful, order has always trumped justice, I would argue. And I would argue that one of the things that human rights tried to do was to bring justice in, to make those justice questions slightly more central than they have traditionally been in law. So law has always, as I say many times, been the instrument designed by the powerful to protect the interests of the powerful. This idea of using law for empowerment and justice has been in, I think when you look at the broad slew of law over the centuries, I think you'd be hard pressed to find enough evidence that justice has been as much of a project as order. And I think we see this now, especially again in the context of threats we face and how we immediately go for the ordered option over the justice option. So that's a very broad way of saying that law hasn't paid enough attention to something that happens within a household. When you ask the question, is law even aware of it? You'd say, well, how does law become aware of a problem? Law becomes aware of a problem because cases come to court. Very often these kinds of cases are unlikely to come to court because of the fact that if there is feminization of politics, and now I would qualify it in view of what you've said, Sarah, if there is a feminization of politics in a particular context, you can bet that the people who are facing that poverty, i.e. the women, don't have access to a lawyer. You can pretty much bet it, because they're going to have to go past the male in the household to get to a lawyer. So already, with the fact that we're talking about poverty, there's already a disconnect between the poor and law. In addition, we're now talking about somebody who's disempowered, further disempowered and disenfranchised in that poverty equation. So the case coming to court is pretty unlikely in that sense. Then the other way in which law can become aware of this would be through a legislative process. But again, a legislative process requires a parliament to be mindful of this, to sit down and decide to construct programs. And this is one of the reasons why I am perhaps not as negative on conditional cash transfers, is because at least society is signaling as a whole that this is a problem to be dealt with through policy. I think in the vast majority of places, that's not even an option. We're not even going to be talking about it because policymakers aren't talking about it. Policymakers and legislators might talk about it at times of election, where promises can be made about poverty alleviation. And there you're looking at the poor as vote banks. You're not looking at the poor as a technical social problem to be fixed. You're not looking at re-engineering society to change power equations. You're looking at it as a pure vote bank question. And so promises are often made. And I certainly, in the country that Chiteshri and I come from, in India, this is a very normal promise at election time, poverty alleviation. But I'm not sure, Chiteshri, even in Indian context, that we necessarily think about that as a particularly feminine face to it, even though it might be. So the short answer, is law aware of it? I would say no. Has law done much about it? I would say no. What could law do about it? I mean, it's linked very much to this idea that women have to be perceived and be active in being subjects of law, not objects of law. And it comes back very much to that. If women are merely objects of law, so you're worrying about poverty as a household issue, and women are like the other things in the household, literally things, some of which might be human, some of which might not, then you're not likely to be able to design a tool that's sharp enough. And law is a blunt instrument anyway. So it's not going to be law necessarily that is going to push this forward. It perhaps is going to be social change that makes this that brings this to the forefront of awareness enough for law to be able to deal with it.
You're absolutely right, Joshua. Actually, what disturbs me so much is in our Indian Penal Code, which of course we inherited when did it come? 1890 something that it was instituted. There's still an offenses against marriage. There's a section which is offenses against marriage, which clearly is a very patriarchal instance, because it looks at woman being the property of a man, and therefore if the man can get charged for adultery if he has slept with the wife of another man. So as if somebody has stolen the property that is in there. So in terms of, it's very clear that at least in terms of criminal law and in terms of the letter, actual text of the law, a lot of it is still not at all, forget gendered, it's not feminized, and it's definitely not looked at this. And it is disturbing that we are in 2017 and this is the reality of it. But in terms of change, that we're looking at legislative change and we're looking at changes, as many as petitions or what can be actually challenged on this, isn't it possible for us to actually eclipse such provisions and look to the future, or do we still need to find social recourse for that?
Well, I mean, the short answer is any provision can be changed by Parliament. So that if it becomes enough of an issue, Parliament can pretty much do or undo anything. The question is, do they have the political will? Who's compelling them to do it? Now, we are doing a project with Erica Howard, who has been on this MOOC before, who's our expert on equality law here at Middlesex University. We're looking at a project in a variety of different countries of the extent to which equality issues can be forced through a legal system. So if you just think this argument through and why it's relevant to what we're talking about today. So we're starting from the premise that, and we did this in Brazil 2 weeks ago, where we looked at Brazilian incidents of, for instance, earning by a black woman compared to a white woman and a white man in Brazil. And the figures are absolutely shocking. I mean, I haven't seen anything like that anywhere else, not even in India, where you're really looking at a construct by which neither the 50% of Brazilian population, which is either Afro-Brazilian or somehow not white Brazilian, is necessarily focused on this issue because they are into subsistence mode, and neither are the legislators who come from the top 10% of Brazilian society focused on it because it's a non-issue for them. So you literally have nobody worrying about equality issues at all. So the premise that we started off with at a university in the south of Brazil was, if you need to achieve equality through law, you're going to have to force that change in to the top. It can't be, in this context, it's less likely to be a grassroots movement. So how do you force it then? Can you achieve equality through social change? Well, only if there are enough people there who are actively engaged in trying to solve that particular problem. But it's a really hard one. And we're guided by our Brazilian partners on this one. And the Brazilian partners are saying, well, this has not really been an issue in terms of understanding what law can do to create affirmative action measures, to create challenges, to create quotas. You know, again, comparing it to India, it's startling because in India, affirmative action measures and quotas have been a standard way of trying to address this. And there's mixed data there about the extent to which it works. So in terms of whether law can contribute to this program, I saw immediately two contrasts there. One, where this had not been talked about in any legal sense, but Bolsa Familia, the conditional cash transfer system that Sarah spoke about before, had been used. So you had social policy mechanisms, if you like. And the Indian system, where you have a more legalistic, quota-driven affirmative action measures. Look, neither is going to be perfect. But I'm still struggling to understand which one would tackle the feminization of poverty, again, with the caveat that it exists in the places where it exists. But I'd love to hear your view.
I think when you were talking, one thing that came to my mind was a comment you made a while back, which is around the household and rights within the household. Because it's very interesting, because when we start talking about women's rights and the responsibilities of men and women within households, is normally divorce proceedings.
Yeah.
We don't tend to talk about it in legal terms, other than in those circumstances.
Absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
Domestic violence has begun to creep into some extent,
but violence against women, again, that's not, that's because it's seen as unusual, or which it isn't. Obviously, one in 3 women across the globe experiences violence or fear of violence in her lifetime. But it's an exception. It's treated as an exception in law, isn't it?
Yes.
So it's the day-to-day roles and responsibilities of men and women, or men and men, or women and women within households is not something that's addressed in law.
No, because law assumes a solidarity of unit,
which is an unfortunate assumption.
Yeah, of course. Where groups are vulnerable, it always is, whether it's women and men or who are in an ethnic group, or that's the problem. The assumption made of a solidarity that just because you're Rohingya, for instance, and you're a vulnerable group, that all the Rohingya face the same issue. It's an assumption that doesn't always stand the test of time. So.
But I think in the household sense, what's interesting is that in legal terms, we think about that, and economists also make that assumption.
Do they?
Yeah, they have the assumption of this household, this unitary household that has corporates for the good of the whole household. Yeah. And I think it was Becker, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who suggested in households to make sure they function well, there was a benevolent dictator, which seems a contradiction in terms. And who's altruistic in the household and who's looking after the well-being of the household, we naturally say a woman. But of course, our benevolent dictator is the male head of household. But that's the how the economy.
Benevolent.
Not always so benevolent. That's the term that was the benevolent dictator. So the household is really a taboo site, and in many ways, but then other ways, government does enter into the household in terms of cash transfers, etc., etc. So the household is very interesting. I mean, you used the term domestic violence. This term is one that people who work around violence have tried to move away from using. Because in its very construction, it's keeping it. This is
inside the house.
Inside the home. That very terminology, and then watching the language change around violence is really interesting to see how society is changing in terms of moving away from domestic violence to violence against women and girls, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. Yeah. With gender-based violence, also, of course, accepting all violence, all genders. Anything that's gender-based. So we can see that move. And the terminology is so important because it tells us what society thinks. And law still uses
law uses the word domestic violence. Certainly, and I apologize for my use of the word. Absolutely, violence against women and girls, or violence within the household, or violence in general is an issue there. But yeah, I mean, again, I think, Chidishri, your example, rape as a crime against a property, rather than a crime against a person. So there are, when you look at the manifestations of this discussion in law, yes, it's very far back, and I think it also shows you that law in many cases it's not a lead indicator; it's a lag indicator. Society changes, and then law is forced to change, and that's the assumption that's made. So that means a lot of violation has to occur. Lots of genocide has to occur before somebody says, come on, let's create a law. Let's not have this genocide business. And it almost is like that the law follows rather than leads. And partly I'm actually reassured by that. And the reason I'm reassured by that is because the societal power structures are so patriarchal that I'm not sure that law as a lead indicator would necessarily give us a better outcome.
No, because I was interested when you were saying that. I was suddenly sitting here thinking through, do we want legal aspects to enter into the household? Do we want laws around how men and women or same-sex marriages operate within that space? What would it look like, and what would it mean for intimate partnerships?
Well, I would
argue
there
was legal aspects to it. You didn't do the dishwasher.
No, I know. Look. But let's just think about law in slightly broader terms. I would argue law is very much in the household, doing that through religion.
Well.
Which is another form of law. It's another form of mores. It's another form of ordering society. And I think religion has very much been in the household and determined many of these issues through time. So yes, okay, in the sense that it's not a law passed by a parliament and printed on headed paper with the government crest. It's not law. But is it not law in any other sense?
No, I mean, I was thinking about regulations and legal in that sense. But of course, if we're going to look at it in that way, the whole law is part of the patriarchal structure and maintains it. So, of course, yes, it's in there. And the lack of laws is also something that tells us about what's important. So the patriarchy is maintained through a lack of law. And that will maintain.
I think the household law and the role of the household is an interesting one. But I would argue on things like climate change, for instance, I would want law to be a lead indicator there. Because it's not going to happen. We're not going to force this behavioral change unless you start regulating the extent to which any of this can be changed. I was in the Arctic Circle last week and at a polar law symposium.
Can we just comment? So he's been in Brazil, now he's in the Arctic Circle.
Josh was traveling everywhere.
I cycled there. I didn't use any.
I was going to say, how did you get there?
In the context of the Arctic Circle, though, but one of the discussions there is the fact that there will now be an Arctic route from Asia into Europe. Because the ice cap is melting. And you actually have a scenario by which you'll have 60,000, possibly 60,000 massive ships going through an Arctic route to get to Europe. Now, how else are you going to do it other than by regulating it? How else are you going to do it other than by saying, look, there's a no-go area, there's a marine protectorate, there is a tax to be paid? How else do you do it? So there are some instances where law should and could and ought to be lead indicators. I'm not sure the household is one of them.
No, I agree, but I think those...
Joshua, while we're on the household, sorry, Sir, I'm interrupting you here because there's been a very good question that's come in where, because this week has actually discussed in Sarah's lectures the concept of income poor and well-being poor. So Dominic has says that I like the concept of not income poor but well-being poor, and to what extent this notion can be taken on board by policymakers. She's asking this also in context of the fact that Bhutan measures gross national happiness instead of GDP, and now we're talking about climate change where it needs to actually even look as low as an indicator. This broader question of measurements and indicators. What do we look at in terms of just poverty and the redefinition of poverty? The idea of income versus well-being. And could we get a recap of all your comments on that so that we can continue this discussion with that clearly in our heads?
That's a good point, because I realized when I was talking earlier, I didn't really talk about that, and I was very much talking about income poverty. And when we look at women's well-being in particular, and this is where most of the research has been, we need to look at these intersecting poverties. So we've got the income poverty, income deprivation. Then we've got what people call asset poverty. So the differential access, but not just access to, control over assets. Because a household may have the asset, and think about it this way. So you have a TV set, so the person going around measuring says, oh, you've got a TV set in your household, everyone can watch it. You've all got that same asset, but I'm sure we've all had fights over who watches what on a TV set, and then someone has control over. So assets are there, but control of assets is what's important. So people can have asset poverty, not income poverty. Then we've got what we call time poverty, and time poverty is, of course, incredibly important. So the most time poor tend to be women, particularly those who are engaged in work outside the home or for income, productive work, and still having to do main body of the housework. So then they become time poor. So you can see how they interrelate. If you have an income, you're more likely to have assets. But if you have an income, you earn your own income, you might be more time poor. So you reduce your income poverty, but you increase your time poverty. And then another one we talk about is power poverty. And this is very much something that Sylvia Chance worked around, this issue of power poverty. And it's around the idea that, and it stems back actually to work that around households, so back there in the households, starting from the economists, around how resources are used within households. So if you have an income, you're more likely to have a voice in the household. If you have a voice, you're more likely to be able to make decisions to improve your own well-being and reduce your power poverty. That's the assumption. But of course, if you're bringing an income into the home, then it doesn't naturally automatically translate into voice. So the research suggests that women, are less likely to have an income. When they have an income, it's less likely to translate into voice because social norms are greater than their income value. And even when women do have a voice, because they're socially constructed to make decisions that better the well-being of everyone, they're less likely then to use that to improve their own well-being. So we've got these intersecting poverties on an individual level. Then, of course, we've got all these more intangible measurements that go into well-being, as Josh was saying, around climate change and the environment. The notion of environmental or natural capital is now being introduced a lot by the economists. And it's not just about using the resources, but just looking at a tree and enjoying it. And that links to the happiness index. And of course, the happiness index, what we find is that those countries who score highly on happiness are actually those countries with greatest equality. Where there's least inequality, it tends to go together. There's more happiness in those countries. So we can see...
Sarah, to interrupt you out there, because there's been a comment that has come in on the live chat, where Reggie has said that women are tied with their reproductive roles, even when they want to be productive. Does this actually perpetuate the cycle of poverty, or can the cycle of poverty be broken? It's a complex comment, but this is the right time for us to hear your views on this.
I think that the only thing that women are tied to is actually they're the only ones who can give birth. It's not that women are the only ones who can care for children. It's socially constructed that women should care for children more than men. Now, if we want to release women to do productive work, then obviously we can do it in a society. There's no reason why it should be the woman who brings up the children. It could equally be a man, and we're seeing that much more. We're seeing that much more, and particularly when women now who do go into workplace may be able to earn higher wages, have more job opportunities than men, and therefore we are starting to see that shift. So this idea that women are tied by their reproductive role, it's not about biology. Yes, women give birth, but social care for those children could be equally shared. So yes, we could break that, but what we need to think about is, and this is a question that's seldom asked, what do individual women with all their different characteristics, intersections of age and disability and ethnicity, what do they want to do? This should be the fundamental question. Do they want to stay at home and look after children as choice? Do they want to do both? Do they want to? And that's the issue. We never really address that. What do people want to do? It's just often assumed we know what people will do or should do.
Isn't that also a factor? I mean, because I'm thinking about that question again in the context of families living in extreme poverty, where women are essentially turned into baby machines. Because the idea is you feel this sense of insecurity. And I don't think the women were asked, by the way, in many of these contexts anyway. But there is this sense of insecurity there, by which if you have more children, they will be able to somehow help out and create that subsistence, or I don't know, maintain that subsistence and hope for a better day, I guess. And that's that level of insecurity that exists in a general context. Whether women feel it more than men, I couldn't comment, but inevitably the impact is on the woman, because the woman is now in that child rearing mode, or not even child rearing, childbirth mode, but childbirth modes that last for 9 months plus 6 months, or 9 months plus 9 months, or whether that, but if it's a serial childbirth issue, then those are years and years and years lost. And of course, the impact of that is on, in most of these cases, it's not like you're then going to divide your vast land into smaller parcels. It's you're creating more landless laborers. So that sense of it not being biological but being constructed,
of course,
is so prevalent even in those kinds of examples.
No, in those kinds of examples, incredibly so, because why have children in that context? You have children, you have more children because there's a possibility that at least one or two will die. So you have more, yes, and then you have more households. Plus, you work on the benefit that there's no social security when you get old. More children have, the greater likelihood at least one of them will be nice enough to look after you when you get older. So you can see the rationality behind it. And then, of course, in many cultures, men are deemed to be, if you're in a situation where you don't earn a lot of money, you're not a good provider, that there is, particularly in conflict or violent situations, you're not a good protector. So where do you prove your manhood? Your manhood comes from having large numbers of children, often with more than one woman. So we can see the social constructions and how they're linked to poverty. It's so clear.
Sarah, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Sarah, this idea of, you just spoke about it and I want to ask again, this idea of proving your manhood, or in terms of, because this is so present in my culture and where I live, in terms of virility is associated with fertility. And then we see in India, it's a very obvious dynamic. We see urban stress causing families who want to conceive in this city just not being able to. And then in villages where, there is so much targeted planning for family planning and for actually equating the status of and trying to convince people to have 2 children. That's not happening there. Where children are necessary, right, especially for farming, for land, for labor, their government policies are targeted where they're encouraged not to have so many children. And by contrast, here it's I mean, this ties into the larger context of, our measurements and indicators where we're looking at gender as a basis for calculating all these indices. I mean, don't you think that this would have such a positive effect in even understanding various phenomena, which is so current? And I'm just wondering, why hasn't this happened, where we actually are able to calculate and see the effects that all these measures have on women, and that on its own would actually give us a better idea of how the economy is doing?
I think in part, often the policies that we're talking about, we want to evaluate, The thing is with policy evaluations, what people tend to do is they have the targets, the outcomes they expect, and they go and measure whether they met their own outcomes. They don't go and see what actually happened with my project, what actually happened with my policy. And because women are targeted with resources, but they're for other aims. So Maxine Molyneux has described this as, rather than development policies servicing women, women are at the service of these policies. And so they don't look to see what the impact is, because in essence, it's good for them not to look. Because if there's negative impacts on the women, they'd have to do something about it. But as it stands, women are very good, efficient deliverer of services. So we're back to this idea of policymakers are interested in efficiency, economic growth, and women are productive and efficient at delivering services to others. So those negatives on women, they're not seen to be that important, because women, again, we're back to the household, they're unseen. Yeah. You don't see the cost to women in terms of their time poverty. That's not seen. What's seen is the benefits to society in terms of productivity.
Yeah.
Joshua, your comments on that in terms of looking visibility of women in the household. What do we see in the future? There are several studies where people are trying to calculate this and compute it, and it's part of the whole gender mainstreaming agenda, gender mainstreaming into policy, gender mainstreaming into law. We have a question coming from Dominic, and she says, do you think women will really get a good share if this is actually mainstreamed? Back to the question about law versus society, what comes first, that chicken and egg syndrome. But
yeah. No, I think I'd be foolish to try and answer a chicken and egg question. So I won't try to, but essentially I think, yeah, exactly. We probably just both disagree that it should be either chickens or eggs. I think the visibility question, part of me wonders whether the presence of social media individualizes people more to the extent that now there is greater visibility, and part of me fears it. The part of me that fears it, I think, is the part that has seen the crazy impacts we've had in the political space with social media.
Yeah.
And the crazy impact we've had in the political space with cacophony, because there's so much noise and there's so much stuff out there that it's hard to know what stuff is worth looking at and what is just stuff that should not even be, should be quality controlled out in many senses. But who determines that? So I don't know. The honest answer is I don't know. I do see some shreds of hope and some slivers of hope in the fact that the girl child in societies that have a greater degree of equality and access are possibly accessing the internet and possibly accessing social media in similar numbers. I don't know. I haven't looked at that enough, but certainly in the society I live in, I don't see a distinction in how, or in that access question. And that partly gives me hope, because it partly means that we will stop looking at household and we will start looking at individuals. At the same time, there is the cultural norm underpinning it, which is that in many societies, there has been this difficulty of, do we emphasize the individual or do we emphasize the community? Laws are very much framed in a Western context based on individual rights, based on what every individual wants, but we've seen they haven't necessarily delivered equal access or rights for all those individuals anyway. In other places where you've had a more communitarian focus, you've said to individuals, look, I don't care what you might think is good for you. What's good for the community is this, therefore you are put into this role. Now, where women are concerned, that has meant total disempowerment, because that has meant that a group of people within that society or within that community who exercise power determine what women should do as good for the society. And then you're back into that equation of, well, your role is in the household, your role is to bring up children, my role is to go out and hunt for food. Those kinds of elements there. So it is a classic chicken and egg one. I think it's really, really hard to understand it. But I do believe that the visibility aspect is central to tackling any of these issues, because one of the reasons we are where we are with the structures is the invisibility issue.
I think I agree with you on a general level, but something came to mind when you were just talking then, and I can't remember the exact quote. It's from Sherilyn McGregor, and she's talking about climate change. And she's
sorry, somebody's at my doorbell, so please continue.
And she's making the point that you've got to be careful what you wish for in gender terms. And it's very dangerous to actually talk about and visibilize how good women are at doing certain things, because that's what policymakers have used in this feminization of poverty alleviation. And Sylvia Chance talks more broadly about this, about the feminization of obligation and responsibility. And I've looked at it in a disaster risk reduction context, and but also looked at it in a climate change context.
Yeah.
And what you find is this idea that, oh, women aren't naturally carers. Women care for the planet and women care for the children. And therefore we should target our policies to reduce climate change or to improve disaster risk reduction or to a myriad other things. Because of the when you sometimes you bring attention to it. Visualization through the social media. I find it fascinating because I'm old-fashioned jobs are now we're on it. The youth role is other things. But when I find it very interesting because it visualizes what women are doing and what different voices are doing. But when you were talking again, I was just thinking about in terms of patriarchal structures, where does it sit within reinforcing patriarchal structure? I never really thought about it before in terms of the patriarchy. Yes, it gives voice, but they're selective, aren't they?
Yeah.
And
what kind of voice is it, and what is it saying?
Yeah, and it might make certain women visible, but then that also makes them targets for attack, for trolling, etc., and that can actually reinforce the silences again. So, it's this whole thing. Maybe it's when I think about patriarchy as this big bubble that we all live in, and how do we break free from that? It's very difficult to think how, and just by visualizing women's roles can actually add to that, add to their burdens, rather than change it.
Sure, but and I think that's that's the gap that we have to keep worrying about, because but I don't see how we can get change without visibility. That's the problem. And I think on this issue, if we do have evidence of the feminine characteristics of poverty in a context, I guess at least it creates an imperative to try and address it. But absolutely, it might also create an imperative to ignore it.
I think we need to go back to the very original thesis that was around. This is again, we had this notion of gendered experiences of poverty. So people like Cecile Jackson, back in the 1990s, was writing about gendered experiences of poverty. And then it was taken up to mean something else. And she wrote a very famous paper on rescuing gender from the poverty trap. What was actually the research was saying is that men and women and different genders experience poverty in different ways. And the way these different aspects intersect, the time, the power, the asset, the income, poverty. And therefore, for me, make that visible. We need to go back to that, but that's messy. It's not like, just saying this group is income poor and that's that. But if we go back to the gendered experiences of poverty, as it intersects, then yes, make that visible. And then I think we can move forward.
So the collection of different narratives?
Sorry?
The collection of different narratives, the dissemination of different narratives, and how it's experienced. I mean,
it's about how people, because at the end, why are we so worried about poverty? We're worried about it because of people. Yet we're just looking at these big metrics. We're not looking at people and how they understand it. And there's research out there where people have gone and talked, Kathy Mackle did some research with Caroline Moser, and they went, I think it was in Colombia, and they talked to, they had a group of young boys, and they said, "Are you poor?" And for them, they were poor outside, and this boy said, "No, I'm not poor." And they said, "Why aren't you poor?" And he said, "Because I've got shoes."
Yeah.
Because I've got shoes, I'm not poor. Because if I've got shoes, obviously you could go to school, but go without shoes. So that's how poverty was understood.
Yeah.
And if we get back to that and visualize how people, and it's not just listening to the voices, it's actually the experience of it, how you live it, because you live poverty. But we don't engage with that. We're too messy.
Yeah.
Those are indeed some wonderful insights. I love the idea of living it and then visualizing it. That's that puts me on a different thought process. We had one question, Sarah, from last week's gender webinar. And unfortunately, we did not have time to ask that. So I'm just going to close this session with a question that had come in from Shirley on our discussion forum, because we were discussing at that point about gender and sexuality. She's asking if there's any scientific evidence to say, because again, this comes on natural versus social construct. So she's asking, is there scientific evidence that a child as young as 5 or 6 is able to determine his or her sexuality?
Okay, so I'm smiling.
It's a big question.
For me, maybe it's not a big question, because you'd first of all contest what we mean by scientific evidence.
Okay.
What scientific evidence means, because what evidence do we need really in this context? So there's this scientific evidence and a body of work that might say about development of brain, etc., etc. But when we're coming down to this, I don't know it's scientific evidence that we need. What we need to understand is, again, the experiences of people and how children as young as 5 and 6 are experiencing their life that makes them feel that this is the case. And I wouldn't say to look for scientific evidence. I think we're looking in the wrong place there. What we're looking for then also is society to recognize and understand. I think that's more important, back to the social construction, than having a body of scientific evidence. So that society has, that child then has the space to sit and talk about what they're feeling and what they're thinking. And it's understood as it's valid. Their feelings are valid. I don't know that scientific, a body of scientific evidence is what I would be looking for. So it's about knowledge there, isn't it? We're back to onto a question of how do we know?
Yeah.
How do we know? Yeah. Is it through science, or is it through understanding experience?
And on that, especially about understanding experiences and understanding what is natural and what is social construct, which I think lies at the basis of us even having a good discussion on gender, even in the future. I would just like to take a minute for all the people who've tuned in to please ask them that if they haven't done the gender profiles exercise, this is a great place for us to start, because we'd like to discuss this in our upcoming Q&A sessions. And this would also give us a very nice head start into discussing this idea about what is social construct, and especially in gender. And then we can actually build that discussion further into looking at it in society, in law, in patriarchal structures, in religion, what that means for today, and of course what that means for the future, because that's what we're all worried about in the end, especially in this discussion where we're discussing this.
May I interrupt just to make viewers aware of tomorrow in Stockholm, there's a Right Livelihood Award being given out, and this work is given out really to people who may not work in science and economics and literature and all these areas. It's called the Alternate Nobel. And tomorrow 2 people are being recognized. There's actually 4 being recognized, but 2 who I know very well. And I'd just like to make people aware of it, and maybe they can find a way to Google and tune into it. Colin Gonsalves, who is the founder director of Human Rights Law Network in India, and who famously won the Right to Food case in a coalition in 2002, which is studied across the world in law schools. He's being decorated for his work on human rights. And alongside him, Khadija Ismailova, who's a very, very powerful human rights advocate from Azerbaijan, who's unfortunately under house arrest and can't go to the ceremony. She's being celebrated for the work that she's playing in the moment in the face of a very repressive regime in Azerbaijan. So I think I just want to make people aware of that, to see the kinds of work that people are doing around the world against great odds, and how they are making difference to the lives of many people that are extremely vulnerable in extremely vulnerable societies. So I do hope you will maybe take a moment to Google it and find out who these people are, and to see that sometimes good work does get recognized too.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Thank you very much, Sarah. And to all our viewers, thank you very much for tuning in. And we look forward to having you sometime next week.
Look forward to it. Okay. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.